Bom dia, sejam muito bem-vindos ao meu canal no YouTube. Hoje teremos um debate muito estimulante sobre direito, robótica e inteligência artificial, com a participação do professor Simon Chesterman, que além de ter extensa obra na área do direito internacional, é atualmente diretor da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade Nacional de Singapura. Bom, desde o início, o canal tem o objetivo de debater temas relevantes da área jurídica com uma perspectiva transdisciplinar. Há uma preocupação de trazer temas de análise econômica do direito, do diálogo do direito com a arte, e certamente o tema da inteligência artificial pretende uma aplicação, já há muitas décadas, mas principalmente para o futuro muito próximo, uma aplicação na solução de conflitos. Então, a inteligência artificial, além de ser um tema por si só transdisciplinar, reclama uma atenção quando nós debatemos também as perspectivas de decisões por algoritmos, as perspectivas de utilização de tecnologia para a solução de disputas. Por isso, o tema da inteligência artificial interessa bastante as pautas que tradicionalmente têm sido debatidas aqui no canal. Desde já agradeço bastante a participação de vocês, recomendo que se inscrevam para que possam acompanhar os temas que são trazidos aqui e sintam-se também à vontade para nos comentários sugerir outras pautas. Now, switching to English, it's my great honor, Professor Simon, to host you here today. Good evening to you and your colleagues in Singapore. This subject is hugely important, not only to law, but also to other areas of knowledge, to other areas, including politics, economics, commerce, arts. And it's a great opportunity to have such a distinguished expert in this field, especially due to the recent publication of your very own on With the Robots, which is a very interesting and a fundamental reference for understanding this subject. So, Professor Simon, thank you for being here. I understand that your schedule is very tight, so perhaps you can introduce yourself to our audience and meet our Brazilian colleagues who are now watching you live.
Obrigado, Enrique. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be there virtually. I mean, Singapore, as you might see behind me, is a beautiful country, but I've long admired Brazil. I've got to know many Brazilian lawyers and legal academics, and I really hope to visit in person at some point. But so my name is Simon Chesterman. I'm an Australian, educated among other places in China, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, worked in the US for 6 years, and now I've been based in Singapore for 16. And so for the past decade, I've been Dean of the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, which I think comes out in some of the breadth of the book. I basically used many of my colleagues as sounding boards to bounce ideas off. But perhaps most relevant to your audience is I'm also Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore, which is a national level institution trying to promote research into the technology, the fundamental research of artificial intelligence, but also governance of it, so that we can try and do two things in the governance stream. One is to ensure that AI is in fact trustworthy, and that's really the topic of the book, how to regulate artificial intelligence, get the benefits, mitigate the harms. But a second thing we're looking at AI Singapore is whether humans will in fact trust AI, what dynamics will shape the human-machine interface, in what circumstances people will actually rely on AI. And I think that's going to be crucial to really being able to take advantage of this fourth industrial revolution in a way that is safe and respectful of both the opportunities available, but also the rights and needs of individuals.
Perfect, Professor. But just to start our debate, from a legal perspective, what would be the proper definition of artificial intelligence?
So this is a great question to start off with, because there's no good answer. And I think the European Union, having about a year ago put down a marker saying, right, we're going to regulate artificial intelligence, immediately was faced by all sorts of questions. Well, what exactly are you talking about? Because they're talking about real-time biometric surveillance, so sort of smart cameras that are watching you, trying to work out what you're thinking, feeling, doing, but also autonomous vehicles, which are completely different. in terms of the problems that they give rise to. So I actually don't think it makes sense to have a legal definition of artificial intelligence. I mean, the scientific definition of artificial intelligence is linked to the idea of human intelligence being done through a synthetic mechanism. Either generally, that's the idea of general AI, a sort of robot consciousness perhaps, that remains science fiction for the future, or what I'm focusing on certainly in my work, which is narrow artificial intelligence. So what we mean by that are machines, computer systems that are able to perform tasks that would traditionally be performed cognitively by a human.
But out of curiosity, how did you come to the subject of AI in your research? Because you have an extensive research on international law, on international legal themes. So how did artificial intelligence was brought in your attention?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been interested in computers. It was never an area of serious research. But the intersection came after I realized that I'd spent about 20 years looking at public authority in crisis, or challenges to public authority. So my doctoral dissertation was on humanitarian intervention. So whether if one state turns on its own population, another state can intervene. I did work on transitional administration, in what circumstances the international community can come in and take over that public authority. I looked at national security, terrorism, when external actors are threatening public authority. And then really over the last 7 or 8 years, it became clear to me that technology was posing a new threat to public authority, not in the sense of terrorism or a state turning on its own population, but in that it really challenged the ability of regulators to maintain public control of activity within the state, because more and more of this activity was either taking place through private corporations or in particular through autonomous systems, which were increasingly fast, autonomous, and opaque, which makes it very hard to regulate.
Speaking of challenges to traditional authority, one of the fields, one of the subjects of international law that you have researched previously, and also that you mentioned that there are some similarities to artificial intelligence, is private military and security companies, the role of mercenaries. This is a subject that I myself have researched. I'm very interested in. So how could we make the bridge between these two fields in order to think of regulating this traditional phenomena of the 21st century?
Yeah, so I mean, as you said at the outset, I mean, there is a category challenge with artificial intelligence. And so I looked for analogies elsewhere. And one of the key messages of the book is we don't actually need a lot of new rules. The challenge is not that there's a kind of legal vacuum into which artificial intelligence is stampeding. The challenge is, well, how do we apply existing rules? How do we use existing institutions to regulate these activities that are fast, autonomous, and opaque? And the analogy with mercenaries, I think, is telling, because one way in which we regulate is by saying you can't delegate. So what I mean by that is if something is illegal for me to do it, it should also be illegal for me to use an AI system to do the same thing. And in the context of government, there is already a rich literature on that in the context of mercenaries and private military security companies. And I think one of the key regulatory challenges in this area is maintaining public authorities' legitimacy. And what I mean by that is governments at the moment are tempted and increasingly will almost be obliged to draw on AI systems to deliver services more efficiently, more effectively. The relationship with mercenaries is that mercenaries similarly have offered a possibility of outsourcing some aspects of public authority. If one thinks back to the Iraq War of 2003, a controversial war, the second largest delegation, the second largest contingent of soldiers after the United States was mercenaries, ahead of even the United Kingdom. And the reason for that is the United States wanted to outsource some of its warfighting activities. And I say it's relevant to AI because in this literature, there is a realization that there are some things that governments just should not outsource. And in particular, warfighting is generally regarded as something that governments shouldn't be outsourcing to private companies. And so my argument in the context of AI is that if a government shouldn't be able to outsource something to a private company, it probably shouldn't be able to outsource it to an AI system either.
I understand. Professor, we're talking about warfare, the similarities, and warfare is actually one of the trends of artificial intelligence in our days. What would be the other trends? And I don't know how big a fan of Isaac Asimov you are, or science fiction in general, but what can we see as a reality in the present or in the near future that was only known as science fiction, and we might actually have to deal legally in this artificial intelligence trends?
Yeah, I mean, so I loved reading Isaac Asimov as a kid growing up, but he's really responsible. Well, he's responsible for great literature, which, well, not great literature. He's responsible for really enjoyable science fiction, which I loved growing up. But he's responsible for two big problems that we face now in AI regulation. The first is, I think he planted, and not only him, but many science fiction authors planted in our minds the idea that artificial intelligence will be human shaped and human level, that it will look like us and be broadly of comparable intelligence to us, and that's Asimov's robots. And I think that's a huge problem in regulation, because it gets in people's minds the idea that we'll be dealing with people like you and me. And there's no reason actually to suspect that. And in actual AI development, people have very quickly moved away from that. I mean, when they were developing autonomous vehicles, no one seriously suggested that an autonomous vehicle should just be a regular car with a robot sitting behind it with its hands on the wheel and manipulating the pedals with its feet. So that's one problem. That's called the android fallacy in the literature. The second problem that Asimov really is responsible for is the idea that we can solve the problems of AI with just a few laws. And these are his three famous laws of robotics, written in 1942. And people forget that the very first story in which he introduced them, called Runaround, the laws didn't work. And indeed, if the laws had worked, if the laws had solved the problems of AI, his literary career would have been brief, because the stories would have been boring. The real enjoyment of the stories comes from the difficulty of applying those laws in practice. Many, many years later in his life, he added a zeroth law to those three laws to demonstrate some of the challenges. And the problem that gave rise to is that there is an assumption on the part of many that what we need to deal with the problem of AI is new rules, that we just need a list of new guidelines, frameworks, principles. And so everyone and their dog have come up with a list of principles. I've got nothing against these. Most of them are broadly acceptable. We've had dozens, well, actually hundreds of organizations, consortia, countries. The Pope adopted one, UNESCO adopted one last year. And the problem is that this misconceives the problem as too hard and too easy. Too hard in that it seems to suggest that we need to reinvent the wheel. We need to reinvent everything to deal with AI. When, as I said earlier, I think a big part of the problem is just applying existing rules to AI. It also misconceives the problem as too easy, because the idea seems to be, if only we could come up with the right rules, that would solve the problem. Actually, the devil is in the details. And what we're seeing now is the challenge of applying these laws in a way that will mitigate harms, so we'll avoid the sort of unfortunate loss of income, loss of life, the sort of damage that can go with AI misbehaving, but without unduly constraining innovation or just driving it elsewhere. And that's what most states and organizations are grappling with right now.
It's very interesting to see this critique of the android fallacy that you mentioned, because since we don't have currently or realistically a social interaction, perhaps this could prevent us from thinking of it as a political problem. I don't know if you would agree, because politics usually are interested in the social arena. I mean, if we are political animals, it is because we deal with each other socially. So if we don't have this social interaction, the trends, the politics of artificial intelligence might be affected. So this brings me to my next question. I mean, what are the most relevant political impacts of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so, and I think one reason why there was an explosion in interest in artificial intelligence over the last half dozen years is two factors coincided. One was machine learning through the 2010s really did take off, and we saw a big series of steps forward in pure AI research and an increasingly opaque decision-making that did pose some issues. But that overlapped with a real regulatory challenge in the political sphere, where it was around 2016, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, with the revelation that social media feeds were being manipulated by, you can broadly interpret them as AI systems, that demonstrated that the impact of this stuff going wrong wasn't limited to an obscure recommendation in your Amazon purchase history, or just an autonomous vehicle killing the occasional pedestrian, but it could actually change world history. It could affect an election in the most important, biggest country in the world, well, the most richest country and most powerful country in the world. And so I think that really did demonstrate the potential impact. And now combining that with things like distributed ledger technology, blockchain, there is a real push to enable transactions that operate outside of governmental authority. And so what this perfect storm demonstrates is that you have opaque decision-making that has the capacity to affect elections and operate in a manner that is extremely difficult to hold to account. And so I think there really is a series of political questions that are bubbling away, which is one reason why, among other things, it's not just the European Union that's trying to get ahead of this, but against many people's assumptions, China. China, I think, has realized the political power of tech companies and is now trying to rein them back in. So you've seen really interesting developments in China just over the last 6 months, where, I mean, if you translate the text from Chinese into English or indeed into Portuguese, and then asked an expert which jurisdiction came up with this requirement, for example, for algorithmic transparency, many people would say, well, that looks like European Union language, when in fact it's China. And the reason China is doing this is precisely because it realizes that these modern systems have the capacity to have major political implications, as well as having the potential for economic growth.
But would there be then, Professor, safe applications of robotics, of artificial intelligence in a very sensitive field of law, which is decision-making itself? I mean, in conflict resolution, in dispute mechanisms, would there be a safe space for artificial intelligence?
So I go back to your very first question, what do we mean by AI? And if you define it too broadly, no one, I think, would suggest that a judge shouldn't be able to use a calculator in determining damages. I mean, using a calculator seems fine. Using a word processor seems fine. But if you move down the sort of automation chain to a judge having a recommended sentence, a recommended verdict that an AI system has presented to him or her, then I think most people start to pause. And so this is where, I mean, one contribution of my book, hopefully, is to break up the regulatory challenge into 3 types of question. Because there are some areas of life where we just want AI to be safe. We just want technology to be safe. So things like autonomous vehicles, I think we just want them to be as safe as possible. And so we want to get the benefits of transportation while minimizing the risks. Similarly, in medicine, I think we want it to be safe. But there are some areas where most of us, I think, would feel that these decisions shouldn't be delegated to machines. And that's where mercenarism comes in. The comparison with mercenaries, I think for many of us, there's a kind of visceral reaction to the idea of an autonomous system in an opaque manner, making decisions on the battlefield as to who lives and who dies. And the reason I think most of us on reflection believe that decision should be made by a human is not necessarily because the human will make the right decision. Often humans make terrible decisions. Humans are racist, sexist, and so on. They get tired, they get angry. But it should be made by a human because he or she could then grapple with the moral dilemma and be held to account in a way that a machine cannot. And then there's a third category of decisions where it's not just that it should be made by a human, it's that it should be made by a particular human. And that's your example of judges, where a judge who is determining the liberties, the rights of an individual, one hopes that a judge is well educated, is able to carry out his or her function well. But the reason his or her decision has legitimacy is not, or at least not just because they're smart, but because they exist within a political hierarchy. And so if we were to delegate that to me, again, it would be the same as delegating the judicial function to a for-profit corporation. And I think we should be extremely careful of doing that. And for the same reason, we should be extremely careful about delegating that kind of decision to a system that the judge does not fully understand and therefore cannot fully take responsibility for.
It's very interesting, this political aspect of judging. I mean, political in the sense of having an accountability after all. Because more and more we talk about arbitration and mediation as means of solving in an alternative manner. But even if we speak of alternative dispute resolution, we're also dealing with trust. I mean, no one will enter into arbitration or mediation if they don't trust the arbitrator or mediator to do to conduct the proceedings in a correct and a just and a moral order, in a fashion that would prevent this kind of risks we're talking about. I mean, so in this sense, it would be paradoxical, apparently, to speak of a robot arbitrator in this sense, because even if you privately choose a judge, it wouldn't. The trust element would be still present.
Yeah, I mean, I would, though, draw a distinction between arbitration and mediation. Because one way, and the difference, I know you know this, but just for anyone who's listening, the mediator doesn't take decisions. The mediator helps the parties reach a decision. And so for dispute settlement, AI systems, particularly for reasonably simple disputes, AI systems can actually be quite efficient. So there's a well-known statistic that eBay resolves something like 60 million disputes every year without any human intervention. And it's not sort of passing judgment. It's sort of offering a settlement, and it sort of facilitates a negotiation between the parties who then reach a reasonable conclusion. So in areas like that, I think AI systems can be good in facilitating dispute resolution. What I'm talking about is your example of the arbitrator, precisely. That I think the idea of handing over discretion to the AI system is something we shouldn't be willing to do until we're really willing to take on the full political implications of delegating large amounts of public power to entities that are not accountable in any meaningful way to a democratic public or any other kind of political system.
I see. And bringing back to this intersection between politics and law, I would like to go to a different level, to international law and politics. Has international law played any role in this debate? Is there an appetite of international politics and global society, if we might say, in global politics, to address these issues?
So there's a lot of talk. And indeed, I think I mentioned earlier, UNESCO late last year adopted these principles. These are non-binding norms. So China, for example, embraced language that said that real-time biometric surveillance should be forbidden. Any kind of social credit scoring should be forbidden, both practices that are well established in China at the moment. But there's a lot of discussion where I think there is real potential is kind of in two directions. One is actually to spread the benefits of AI, because a lot of the benefits of AI require some measure of investment. But then I think there is the possibility for many jurisdictions to take advantage of that and leapfrog certain aspects of development. If we think of telecommunications, the mobile telephone revolution was transformative in many developing countries because they went from not having any telephones to not needing to lay out landlines and being able to communicate. And then there's all sorts of advantages that come from that. So I think there is real potential for AI to optimize the delivery of services, optimize economies in many jurisdictions. And there's some interesting work going on. The International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, has this AI for sustainable development push. Against that, however, in some areas, I think there is a really important debate underway on regulation of lethal autonomous weapons in particular. That is this sort of visceral red line that I at least would like to hang on to, that we shouldn't be delegating life and death decisions in the battlefield to autonomous systems any more than we should be allowing judges in capital cases with the death penalty for those decisions to be taken by AI systems. So there is a robust debate going on at the moment. The International Committee of the Red Cross has argued that there should be meaningful human control in any kind of decision making that regards the lethal use of force, at least. The problem is the sort of salami slice problem, that as you divide up decision making, many people would say, okay, sort of developing a drone, that's fine. Maintaining a drone, piloting a drone, all that can be delegated to AI systems. What about target selection? What about target acquisition, target prioritization? And if all you come down to is that the final decision is that a human in the command chain must press the button, if all of those decisions have been made in advance, we face the problem of what's called automation bias, that most humans, basically, if we're regularly given information and recommendations from a machine, we will attribute to it accuracy and trustability that is often not warranted. And so the danger is, even though in theory you have a human in the loop, it's the human pressing the button, all the important decisions have already been taken and the human is essentially a rubber stamp. So that's why the meaningful human involvement is important. And as I said, that debate's going on at the International Committee of the Red Cross. There's the Conference on Conventional Weapons at the UN that is debating this. There's a possibility of General Assembly action. The challenge is that the states that are most enthusiastic about limiting this technology tend to be the ones with the least access to it. And so it's countries like the United States and China, which have the greatest access to it, who are the wariest of constraining their own innovation in this area.
Yeah. Professor, when we talk about regulation, about legal approach to these issues, and back to the analogy to private military and security companies, the role of self-regulation in our century is huge. I mean, I myself have researched extensively about self-regulation in the ARC market, in arbitration, in private military and security companies market. So I would like to hear you about your take on self-regulation. Of course, we're not talking about the machines regulating themselves. Obviously, we're talking about the tech companies that produce these machines, bringing some kind of self-regulation. Is this happening? Should this happen? Do you think there is a complementary role for these initiatives? What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is there potentially is a role for AI to regulate itself. See chapter 9 of the book, but a very limited one. On self-regulation, I mean, I would divide regulation into 3 levels. The most important is the middle one, which is the state. So governments. Governments are the entities where if you need a regulatory hammer, states have it. And I think that's going to remain the most important, and in the vast majority of situations, that will be the most impactful. There's an element for international activity. We were just talking about that, but a huge role for self-regulation. And I'm not at all against self-regulation. I'm against pure self-interested self-regulation. And what I mean by that is supervised self-regulation. Self-regulation within some kind of framework makes sense. If self-regulation actually means regulation, because sometimes self-regulation just means free market, let me do what I want. And that leads to all sorts of market inefficiencies. And so we saw through the 20th century the move from buyer beware to product liability around the world. And I think that was for good reason. In the context of AI, standards will be extremely important. Interoperability will be very important. The kind of thing that I think is going to be helpful in encouraging positive self-regulation is, let's call it a bit of a nudge before, during, and after the deployment of AI systems. Before that, when a government, when a company is going to develop a new AI system, there should be some kind of impact assessment. They should think, okay, what are the implications of this? And what are the potential harms, and how can we mitigate those harms? They should be obliged to think about that rather than just developing and then saying, well, we couldn't have foreseen this. That's not new. We've got that in all sorts of areas of life. If you're doing research into particular chemicals that are potentially hazardous, you've got to do environmental impact assessments. So do something similar on AI. During, I propose in the book the idea of an AI ombudsperson. And this is the idea of not one piece of legislation, for example, to solve the problems of AI, but a kind of roving entity that can look for potential gaps in the market, because I don't think AI operates in a legal vacuum. I think AI operates across the economy, across the political spectrum, and it's possible in some situations you'll have gaps, and those gaps will need to be filled. And an ombudsperson is a useful, at least, way of trying to monitor that in real time. And then thirdly, in the kind of aftermath, another thing that I think should be required of companies, in particular those deploying opaque AI systems, is just to leave an audit trail, to maintain records so that you have some kind of capacity for transparency. Transparency in two ways. Transparency so that it's always obvious which legal entity is responsible for the activities of an AI system, so it can be traced back to them, and you've got at least the minimum information that you need to understand what happened in retrospect. So that with those various caveats, I think self-regulation will be extremely important, as it is in many areas of life where the reason many bad things don't happen isn't because of the Human Rights Convention or because the police are waiting outside your room, but because you refrain from doing them yourself because you realize it's the wrong thing to do.
Well, Professor Simon is speaking with an 11-hour difference to us, and so we're already approaching the end of our talk. But I would like to tell the audience that to feel free to send any questions. We have a message for student Igor Galissa. No questions, just congratulate and thank the professor for the good discussion. And Professor, I'd like to end with a final question for perhaps open a future debate. I hope we see you very soon here in Brazil. So my final question would be to discuss the possibility of extending traditional legal categories such as personality or responsibility to robots. We have talked extensively about responsibility of ways of assuring this responsibility, but how could we extend the traditional idea of personality and personal responsibility that we use, like in torts and civil law, to the actions of robots? Are we going to refer, for instance, a damage that was committed by a robot? Are we going to refer this damage always to the company itself, or is there a way that we can specify the damage? And to our audience, of course, when I say robot, as Professor told us, we have that Asimov-related bias of thinking about one piece of a humanoid, of android, but robots in the broad sense. I mean, artificial intelligence acting in a way that would damage a person, and how could we specify its personality per se?
For a last question, it's a big one, and it's an excellent question. And I'll separate it also into two aspects. Could we? Should we? And the first part is actually quite simple. Could we? Yeah, of course. Legal personality just means the entities that a legal system understands and accepts to having rights and responsibilities. And so virtually every legal system around the world recognizes the rights of natural persons like you and me, but also artificial persons. The most common one is a company, but there are plenty of jurisdictions that recognize other types of entity. So there are various temples in India, a river in New Zealand, the entire ecosystem of Ecuador has a kind of personality. So yes, we could recognize personality, and indeed Saudi Arabia, to much fanfare, claimed that Sophia, this chatbot with a face, has legal personality. So we could attribute AI, or indeed each different AI system, each autonomous vehicle, each robot could have legal personality in the same way that you can incorporate each as a company. Should we? The should we is much more interesting, I think. And so I would answer this also. I'd answer this in three ways. There are three possible answers to that that might lead us to do what you're suggesting. The first is if it would be efficient. So like companies, are an efficient way of encouraging innovation, balancing risk, encouraging enterprise. And so that's why we have limited liability companies, so that investors will put their money in, they know what the risk is. And so if there was some comparable advantage in the context of AI systems, then getting personality, then that might be worth pursuing. At the moment, all I can see is the opposite. All I can see is actually if an autonomous vehicle had legal personality and it crashed into someone, killing them, and you could only sue that one car, well, why shouldn't you sue Tesla if Tesla is developing the technology, for example? So that would be one possible answer if there was some economically efficient way or reason for doing it. The second reason we might think about recognizing AI as having personality is if it somehow deserved it in an inherent way. So this is not an analogy with a company, but if AI really started to resemble humans. And so this is also not completely science fiction, because 100 years ago, you and I might have had legal personality, but many women, many people of color around the world, many indigenous people might not have been recognized as having legal personality. So the category of natural persons, as we call them, has expanded over time. But we've been very reluctant to go any further than humans. And I talk in the book about arguments concerning chimpanzees, which have been unsuccessful thus far. But you could imagine, I don't think there's a pathway there yet, but you could imagine at some point in the future, AI systems resemble human qualities, the consciousness, the sensitivity to pain and rewards and so on, that there might be a reason for saying, well, they're like us. The problem, and this goes back to the android fallacy, is if we ever really get to that stage where we create human level intelligence, many people think that it would go perhaps dog level intelligence, average human level intelligence, then Albert Einstein. But I think most serious researchers understand that if we ever even get to dog level intelligence, it might very quickly overtake us and become vastly more intelligent than us. And that's the third reason why we might think about giving AI personality at some point in the future, is not because it's efficient or not because it's the same as us, but because it's our only chance. Because if we grant legal personality to AI systems and they surpass us, then there's a better chance that they will recognize us as legal persons in the future. So it wouldn't be that we're being sort of kind to the robots. It's that we would be doing that as a hedge that the robots in due course will be kind to us. So for the moment, I think that is science fiction, but it's certainly a question worth debating at the moment, thinking seriously about. But to put my cards on the table at the moment, no, I don't think we should be granting AI systems legal personality, at least not yet.
Well, Professor, this discussion was very insightful. Thank you very much for your time. We're all very grateful for having you here discuss your recent researches with our Brazilian colleagues. I hope you have a wonderful end of the day there in Singapore. Good night for you and everyone in Singapore. And I hope we can see again. I hope we can meet again, virtually or personally, very soon. Thank you very much.
In person would be great. Thanks so much, Enrique.
Thank you.